Working to survive climate change as a region requires a lot of time, energy, and high-quality data. But securing all of these things often depends on another important resource, funding, which can be quite difficult to come by here in the Caribbean. It's the reason we wanted to spend some more time exploring the climate financing landscape and learning more about the instruments, institutions, and individuals working to deliver much-needed financial support to the cause of sustainability. In our previous episode, we reviewed our conversation with Graham King, head of CESaRE, who showed us some of the different ways university-based institutions use their funding pipelines and broad networks to help drive regional innovation.
We're looking at innovative technologies, which may be bringing in technology that's not previously been deployed in the region, or it might be creating entirely new solutions.
And in this episode, we'll be hearing from Ibrahim Abdullah, a technical officer with the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, about how conservation trust funds can help to mobilize local resources towards important causes, including those that are in desperate need of attention.
The decision on what will be funded will come down to what the environmental and women's organizations on the ground put forward, and then those would, have that impact in country.
So let's talk about the role of conservation trust funds and their potential to drive regional sustainability in this episode of CESaRE Voices. In our last episode, we learned about CESaRE and the different ways it channels funding towards worthwhile projects. Using its own methods, the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund sets out to do the same.
The CBF is a regional environmental fund that has a flexible structure that is meant to implement innovative solutions and consolidate resource mobilization in the Caribbean. That's through a range of financial instruments. Currently, the CBF would have 3 different programs. We have the Conservation Finance Program, which is where the core project that we'll hear more about later is based. We have the Climate Change Program, which focuses on ecosystem-based adaptation. And we have the Nature-Based Economies Program, which is our newest program that will have a focus on circular economy, which we will have launched during our recent Finance Congress.
That's Ibrahim Abdullah. He's a technical officer in the CBF's Conservation Finance Program.
Remember, I said the CBF has 3 programs. We have the Conservation Finance Program, the Climate Change Program, which houses the EBA facility, which is where I started, and we have the ACE facility, which is under the Nature-Based Economies Program. So as technical officer in the Conservation Finance Program, you are more or less the project lead for any projects that would come under the Conservation Finance Program. Right now, we have 3 projects. One, the CORE project, which is funded by Global Affairs Canada. We have the CRAB project funded by AFD, the French Development Agency. And we have IMPACT, which is a partnership with the Blue Nature Alliance. So as technical officer, you're more or less responsible for the delivery of that project. In this case, it's the core projects, it's Caribbean Organizations for a Resilient Environment, which is meant to focus on inclusive and gender responsive actions that support vulnerable women to respond to climate change.
We're definitely coming back to the core project. But first, let's get some more context. You see, as Ibrahim just mentioned, the CBF is an environmental trust fund, otherwise known as a conservation trust fund. It's the same thing. It's a private legal entity tasked with securing consistent funding for sustainability projects.
It's meant to be a vehicle for the mobilization and delivery of resources, financial resources for conservation. So there are many different conservation trust funds around the region. I would have started off, for example, at the Trinidad and Tobago Green Fund, where I was a project officer responsible for more or less translating what was at the time legislation and the regulations to a process that we could use to deliver funding in accordance with the national environmental policy. So coming from that background, going to the CBF, I always tell people is the same type of work but regional, where the challenge is similar to fund environmental projects.
The Trinidad and Tobago Green Fund is an example of a National Conservation Trust Fund, or NCTF, and there are several other examples across the region.
For the CBF perspective, these would be autonomous grant-making agencies. For those that have a partnership with the CBF, their boards would be majority NGO. So for the CBF, our National Conservation Trust Funds, partnerships with 11 countries. Of course, we speak to the government, we speak to civil society, private sector, and they all have their own individual boards, and they're all autonomous organizations that, in essence, would be doing local work, whereas the CBF's work is more on a regional scale. So National Conservation Trust Funds implement localized conservation action. In practice, they should be delivering according to their national development programs, biodiversity strategies, climate change strategies, policies. And they would really be the ones who would ensure that their grant making helps to move national issues forward.
An important function of conservation trust funds is resource mobilization.
Resource mobilization, it's probably a fancy word to say fundraising, but it's really to recognize the role of the Conservation Trust Fund to be a house for that store of resources that is committed to environmental management. So currently, the resources could come from a donor. So for example, the CBF endowment was started with funding from the German government, the JEF program and the Nature Conservancy. Resource mobilization could be in the form of the Trinidad and Tobago Green Fund, where you have legislation that gives a certain percentage of revenues that's collected in a fund that's dedicated for conservation. So you have different strategies for resource mobilization across conservation trust funds, but the idea on the other end is the same, where you implement projects that allow us to tackle the conservation problems we have, to take action on climate change. Climate change adaptation, I think, is especially important for these type of funds, where you might have the state taking up more of the mitigation actions, or private sector taking up more mitigation actions. I think because adaptation doesn't always have immediate payback, you're going to have a lot of support for it through grant making, such as would come through the CBF and the NCTFs.
This highlights the potential for NCTFs to maximize the efficiency of conservation efforts within Caribbean SIDS.
I would give kudos to the Trinidad and Tobago Green Fund for having a localized mechanism of resource mobilization. And I think across the board it is recognized that donors are one source of funding, but increasingly that funding source could become more local private sector, local public sector. And I think the conservation trust funds have a good chance of being the hub to direct some of that funding, to remove some of the biases, of course. We have a public sector bias, a private sector bias. The conservation trust funds have that ability to say, our focus is conservation. Of course, we balance the interests, but you could more or less depend on the conservation trust funds to do what is right, I would say, for nature.
Conservation trust funds have been around for decades at this point, working to connect sustainable funding with the right projects. And this allows them to clear pathways not only for parties in need of financial support, but those looking for ways to invest as well.
We always hear around climate finance, and that resources are available, but it's a challenge to get it to the worthy beneficiaries. And I think the CBF's work and the work of National conservation trust funds help largely to solve that problem because they have that local network, that local track record working with different organizations. They could, as the private sector becomes more interested, start to advise them on the opportunities to invest in conservation, maybe in protected areas, which I think is an area that is growing in the Caribbean, both terrestrial protected areas and marine protected areas. But I probably in another podcast, you could go into looking at possible revenue streams, I think, that could come from investment in protected areas and protected area management, which is the real issue. So we have a lot of protected areas that are declared, but I think the opportunities, even for revenue generation, livelihoods, and achieving certain environmental or conservation targets would come from the management of these protected areas. So listeners, I would say a good tip would be to look into protected areas management and opportunities for investment and revenue generation opportunities for projects in these spaces.
Maybe we should do an episode about that. But I'm sure you see the point that Ibra is making. The knowledge and connections that CTFs have gathered over the years puts them in a good position to quickly identify opportunities and eliminate challenges that can often create delays.
In a circumstance where any private sector agency wants to take action on climate and they have a budget that is approved from their organization's level, how that funding turns into conservation projects would possibly be the responsibility of a private sector corporate social responsibility department. And recognizing maybe the limitations of the private sector agency or the opportunity of working with the Conservation Trust Fund to help fill some of the gaps in knowledge, maybe some quick wins in terms of projects that are able to be funded. This would be research that the Conservation Trust Funds would already have. So it shortens that process for private sector agencies that want to do something around conservation.
Through its partnerships with NCTFs all across the Caribbean, the CBF is also able to address serious issues that don't always receive the attention they deserve.
Some people might not be aware that climate change and its effects really impacts women, especially hard.
Women are disproportionately experiencing more poverty than men worldwide. They have access to less financial independence, and they're also less able to bounce back in terms of jobs and training opportunities after climate disasters. After a disaster, often the best and only jobs available are in construction and rebuilding efforts, which are traditionally male-dominated fields.
And that's just scratching the surface as it relates to the disproportionate impact of climate change on men and women. Which brings us back to the core project.
So the core project, it would be aimed at improving the capacity and the organizational development of the CBF participating National Conservation Trust Funds in this project. We are working with conservation trust funds in Belize, Jamaica, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, Guyana, and Suriname.
There are multiple components to the project with the aim of addressing different aspects of the issue.
We have the organizational development part of CORE, which would focus on improving the inclusive and gender responsive mainstreaming in the organizational practices and processes of the NCTFs, providing training or mentorship where is required, having technical assistance coming in from the Canadian gender experts from CUSO International, which would be a big help in country for these NCTFs. The second component, I say, is the Gender Smart facility, where the NCTFs themselves would lead on localized grant making. So yes, the funding comes from Global Affairs Canada. It is a Caribbean Biodiversity Fund project, but decisions on grant making and financing would be made by the individual NCTFs who already have their own grant making programs and mechanisms that could facilitate it. And then the third component of core, I say, is around networking and collaboration. So we really want to have a Caribbean network of environmental funds that would allow for the sort of exchange and networking around governance processes, sharing experiences, and really making sure that all of them are able to foster collaboration and attract resources in their own countries. That could be working with government, working with private sector, and so on.
This networking component serves to support another key process.
It's really meant to have that sort of networking of the monitoring as well, where we collecting through a gender monitoring center, we've called it, data on conservation's impact as it relates to gender. So we want to know about beneficiaries, and we want to know about how these impacts are being felt. And I think projects would allow you to see where some of the targets are necessary. Maybe we have certain trends that we come up with. So I think that's also the beauty of the project, where the decision on what will be funded will come down to what the environmental and women's organizations on the ground put forward. And then those would, have that impact in country. Because I believe individual countries there may be slight variations in how gender roles and norms around gender play out. So I think it's good that we have the country individualized, localized approach, where they are allowed to submit to the NCTFs their ideas for progress. We have some anecdotal information. We have some preliminary information from the EBA facility, which is under the climate change program of the CBF, whereas we have some insight in terms of how gender issues have played out on these EBA projects. But it's not a specific focus of the reporting for EBA facility projects. Now, you may have a section where you could give that explanation. But I think what would happen through core is that we would make these sort of sections of the proposal where you really describe your gender strategy to make it more intentional and focused, so that we make sure that the project activities have that impact that we want to see.
By encouraging more stringent monitoring and reporting practices among grant applicants and conservation trust funds themselves, the CBF hopes to produce more detailed and accurate data that can guide grant-making decisions moving forward.
We do measure gender in terms of measuring the disaggregation on projects and so on. But I think we want to make sure that we are also being gender responsive, which means understanding how the impacts of climate change, the risks and so on, affect men and women differently, understanding the different roles and responsibilities, the access to natural resources, control of those natural resources, decision-making, understanding what gender-specific knowledge we have, and really looking at how we could make our activities, our grant-making, more responsive to the different gender impacts that climate change would have. Of course, now you're also pushed by different recommendations for policies on safeguards and so on, where you have to consider gender impacts. You have to have a gender policy. The CBF does have a gender policy that we are working with, and we will develop further. So through the core project, we want to have, through the Caribbean Sustainable Finance Architecture and through the National Conservation Trust Funds, recognition of being gender inclusive and gender responsive, to have it into the organizational documents, the processes of the Conservation Trust Funds, and then to use that experience that we have to innovate with gender smart, a gender smart facility, as we term it, which would provide funding that is targeted to gender responsive climate change projects. Yes, all climate change projects would usually ask you to include gendered impacts, your gender strategy, and so on. But I think from my experience, this would be one of the first that really targets financing for gender-specific issues around climate change.
Ultimately, the core project aims to raise the profile of gender-related impacts.
I think for the Caribbean perspective, you get to learn as well. So you don't just look at the fact of maybe it's all guys or all girls and make a judgment, but you're really trying to understand why and what would incentivize a more level playing field around these issues. Understanding what people, where people see their opportunities to develop. So I think a big part of what the CBF will be doing is learning, but we are committed to it. And of course, we will be putting the necessary resources towards the Gender Smart facility to ensure that this is a topic which we say mainstreaming. It sounds cliched, but yes, that is what it would be. You shouldn't be able to at the level of your governance to have gender imbalance, or to look at it from your operations, look at it from your program delivery or your program's gender balance, resource mobilization, looking at, are we raising resources that could benefit women more directly and meet some specific needs there. So I think overall, for the CBF, is an exciting time to be looking at, especially creating a gender smart facility, which would build on the work that we've done in the climate change program on ecosystem-based adaptation. It would add, nature-based climate solutions, circular economy, but all with the perspective of having that sort of recognizing the gender differences as we implement these projects. First and foremost, they are conservation projects, but what can it help us to learn and better be able to respond to the vulnerabilities that exist?
I like that you're saying that a part of this is really to try and mainstream this ideal. Because it's kind of sad that if I were to describe the project to someone, and I was talking about climate change and all that, and I brought in that gender perspective, I can see where one or two people would actually be like, how does gender drop into this and whatever? But getting us sort of breaking that, breaking through that, so that people can understand that it's a real issue and it's all connected, really.
And I think I would say, because you raise a interesting point there, where people want to know how gender gets in that and that sort of thing, where I think everybody is born into a gender debate. Right. You're literally born male, female, and then you have these impacts of climate change that affect men and women differently. You have people have different things that they value in terms of men and women and so on, and we have these differences that could affect conservation. In conservation work, I think I've met a lot of women leaders who have made a big impact. And if you really take a look at the landscape of leadership and decision making, we could assess. I think that's part of what we will do as well, to assess, to form that sort of assessment of where we are currently in terms of women involvement in decision making in a conservation space. So we have the societal gender debates ongoing, and we also have the need for action in the climate space, which also has different elements of gender that we need to consider.
Grant funding is the CBF's way of taking action, using distribution mechanisms such as the Gender Smart Facility, the EBA Facility, and the ACE Facility. And there are similar mechanisms employed by NCTFs all across the region.
Funding is available through the conservation trust funds. The grant-making methodology consistently used. We use it in the climate change program with ecosystem-based facility. And used at the NCTF level is usually a call for proposals, where organizations would be invited to submit their projects. based on a specific call. These calls are usually general, allowing organizations to, develop their project ideas for where they that are aligned to the country's national policies. So we also want to make sure we have that impact maybe related to the NDCs, related to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think organizations who would be interested in funding, I would say, in each individual country where the CBF works, look out for the National Conservation Trust funds there. There's a lot of information on the CBF website in terms of the key contacts and so on, where you could reach out to these organizations and follow their progress to make sure that you're aware when we have grant making opportunities, calls for proposals. The EBA facility had its fourth call for proposals last year. So that is a call for proposals that will come directly from the CBF. And I would say within the next year, there would be a call for proposals for circular economy projects under that new ACE facility program.
The proposal process tends to be quite competitive. But as Ibrahim pointed out earlier, this pushes applicants to be targeted and intentional about the design and presentation of their projects.
It's important for organizations that would be interested in getting financing to really look at what the Conservation Trust Fund's aims are, review your national development policies, your national environmental policies, see what is out there on a global level in terms of relating your national work. So you always hear local action with global impact. And I think that is true for organizations to remember that when you're thinking of developing your projects, it might be one small project here, but the impacts of it, the lessons that you learn from it, could go way further than you imagine.
At the end of the day, it all feeds into the overall goal of building regional capacity.
I think as organizations get more experience in receiving grants, they could sort of develop a pipeline of program activities that would give them the long-term sustainability. I know it's not easy, but I think persons seeking conservation or climate finance should always be aware that the job of the funder is to fund. And, we really would like the best possible project. At the CBF, we have the process where we would evaluate the projects. It's competitive, yes. But I'm always amazed at the efforts that people put into an application that you really don't know the final outcome of. So I would say, yes, people should continue to put their best foot forward, understand the grant-making mechanisms, and really look for opportunities to have that in-country collaboration. Share experiences with fellow NGOs maybe on what are your experiences in applying for funds? What gaps do we have? What do we need to learn? And I think that interaction, especially between the local civil society organizations and the conservation trust funds, is one that has a lot of potential to flourish and develop.
One of the great things about having these conversations with people like Ibrahim is that you really get a sense of what pushes them to do the work that they do.
Not really being an environmentalist by training. I sort of became an environmentalist by experience and by doing. So working with the different community groups and having the responsibility to figure out how do you get resources to these people. And I always say I really respect the scientists, the environmental scientists who could explain anything to you. But I really love to see the impact that these projects can have on people and communities. So I think my time at the Green Fund was pivotal. I could call names. I could say that, for example, my experience in Fonzamans, being my first project, seeing that how a community could take responsibility for its own environment. I think that was what got me into environmental management, into conservation, yes, of course, you like the spaces where the projects are, so that helps as well to get you hooked. So when you go on a site visit and they tell you it's right there, it's one little walk, and you go, and you end up seeing, a beautiful part of Port of Spain that you would have never seen before.
It's always good to be reminded that institutions such as the CBF are actually run by human beings who are genuinely invested.
In terms of the personnel of the CBF or the personality of the CBF, I would say it's almost like one of us, where it's somebody who is deeply concerned about the environment, deeply concerned about conservation, sustainable finance, and that balance between people and nature. And I think where we can, we, as much as possible, want to facilitate, to be that vehicle to mobilize the resources in one place and let it impact lives or impact nature in a way that is filtered, as you say, through the national decision-making bodies. So I think that gives it a good a strength. That the CBF is looking at the whole, which is the Caribbean, but really looking to get projects localized as much as possible, and working with the partners in country. I think it doesn't look easy. I know my conservation finance program manager has been busy.
That's full.
Yeah. Busy working with the conservation trust funds to always keep that relationship, because we have responsibilities to them, they have responsibilities to us as partners. But it's really exciting to see, as you said, how resources could come from a donor who wants to implement a program, be filtered through National Conservation Trust funds, who can then direct those resources in countries to those who would best use it, and for the highest impact on nature and conservation.
Climate change presents a number of major challenges for us here in the Caribbean, especially when it intersects with serious social issues such as gender inequality, which renders women especially vulnerable. To make matters worse, many of the mechanisms aimed at adaptation, as well as the ones designed to financially support their efforts, have failed to make these critical connections. And the result is a situation in which those who are most harshly impacted by climate change are often overlooked. Thankfully, institutions such as the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund are operated by people like Ibrahim Abdullah, who are paying attention, and they're working to address these issues through projects such as CORE, which uses measures such as training, technical assistance, and targeted grant making to mainstream gender-responsive practices within the sustainability sector. The work being done by the CBF in this regard gives us an idea of the potential for conservation trust funds in the Caribbean to play an even greater role in our pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals by leveraging their connections and grant-making capabilities to boost effectiveness of projects and programs tackling social and environmental issues. Through increased cooperation with local governments, NGOs, and private sector entities, conservation trust funds can continue to nurture this potential, hopefully shortening the path to a more sustainable future for Caribbean SIDS. Anyway, that's all we have for you on this episode of CESaRE Voices. We'd like to thank our guest, Ibrahim Abdullah, for taking the time to share his insights with us. We'd also like to give a special shout out to our funded partners, the Barbados Environment Conservation Trust, or BECT, and the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, or CECRE, who make these episodes possible. BECT aims to help Barbados reach its national development goals by supporting local initiatives aimed at environmental sustainability, while CECRE promotes renewable energy and energy efficiency investments, markets, and industries in the Caribbean. Of course, we'd also like to thank our listeners for tuning into the CESaRE Voices podcast. If you like what you've been hearing so far, please feel free to give us a rating wherever you're listening. We'd also like to remind you that you can visit our website, CESARjournal.org/donations, to lend your financial support, or join our monthly donor club on Patreon and gain access to exclusive content, or even be featured in an episode of our podcast. Just click the links in the description. And if you'd like to sponsor an episode of CESaRE Voices and feature your company or NGO, Please click on our corporate link to learn more.